Hey everybody, and welcome back to Bo Maths. So today we are going to be using what we've learned in the previous couple lessons about how addition and subtraction shift the number line in order to introduce a really important concept. So let's just do a quick recap here. We know that addition slides the number line to the right, and then we can compare where the numbers line up with, and subtraction slides the number line to the left. And that really seems to be the only difference between the two, really just the direction in which they slide the number line. So we're going to talk about the connection that those two have to each other in a moment. But first, let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a positive versus a negative number? So pause the video and see if you can come up with a difference between the two. Well, you might just say they're different numbers. I mean, yeah, that's true. That is one, maybe the most obvious difference between the two. They're different. However, what if I compared -3 versus +3? So both of these kind of have a 3 involved, so there has to be some sort of connection between the two, right? How does 3 relate to -3? Well, the answer is if we start thinking about numbers as the distance from 0. So 1 is a distance of 1 from 0. 2 is a distance of 2 from 0. 3 is a distance of 3 from 0. Now, if we look at -3, what's its distance from 0? Well, it's also 3 from 0, right? And so basically the size or the magnitude of their distance from 0 is both 3, which is why we're using 3 in these cases. It's just that the negative here means that we're 3 to the left of 0, whereas this 3, which is technically +3, right, means we're 3 to the right of 0. So that is how -3 and +3 are different. It's the exact same distance from 0, it's just going in two different directions. Alright, so with this in mind, if I were to say, okay, let's take this number line and add 3 to it, we know by now that that just means we're shifting it over by 3 to the right. However, if I said, what if we were to add -3 to this number line? So we'll add -3 to the number line. And whenever you're adding a negative, you usually just put the negative number in brackets here just so that you don't think this is like a subtraction, because it's really just the negative. It's really just -3. So how would we move to the right -3 units? Well, it doesn't quite make sense. But if we stop and think, what does a negative do? Well, we saw in the case of 3 versus -3, all it meant is it was just a different direction, the opposite direction as to what it was before. So if instead of adding 3, which moves us to the right, we're adding -3, what would that move us? It would move us 3 units still because we have a 3, but to the left this time. 1, 2, 3, just like that. But you might be thinking for a second, isn't that the exact same thing as just subtracting 3? Because we saw that subtraction also moved the number line to the left. And that's exactly the point that I'm making here. Adding -3 is the exact same thing as subtracting 3. And so we get one very important result from this. Adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive. All right, so we added -3, which, again, instead of adding a positive, which shifts us to the right, we're adding a negative, which means we're going in the other direction. That shifts us down 3, but that's the same as subtracting by 3. So we can do some examples. For example, 7 plus -4. All right, well, we know that adding a negative is the same as subtracting the positive version, so this has to be the same thing as just subtracting 4, right? We're starting at 7, and we're moving 4, but we're moving 4 in the left direction, so that means we're subtracting by 4. So we get 3, and we can visualize this with number lines. So if we just ignore these for a second, I'm adding -4. That means I'm going to be shifting 4 units to the left because we're adding a negative, opposite direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where does 7 line up? It lines up with 3, right? And we see that's the same thing as just doing 7 minus 4, right? So adding -4 or just subtracting 4, both of those operations will do the same thing to this number line. All right, another example would be negative 2 plus negative 4. That is the same thing as negative 2 minus 4, because adding a negative, again, same thing as subtracting, so we get the negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6, and if I wanted to show this with the number line, I start at negative 2, and this number line was added by negative 4 or subtracted by 4, and that gives us the same thing as negative 6. So you may be wondering, okay, so we've just done this for adding a negative. What about subtracting a negative? Because we only have subtracted positives in the last video, right? We did something like 3 minus 2 or 5 minus 4, but never something like 5 minus negative 4 or anything like that. So let's consider that. I want to move this number line, and I want to subtract negative 2, let's say. Alright, so we know how to subtract 2, that's moving it to the left by 2, right? But as we saw, a negative basically reverses the direction we're going, right? Either putting a negative on the number, which meant the number wasn't to the right of 0, it was to the left of 0, or putting a negative on what we're adding, which meant we're not shifting to the right, but to the left. And now, we're subtracting negative 2. Normally, subtraction would move us to the left, but now, because we're subtracting a negative, we're going to be moving to the right because the negative reverses our direction. So we're going to go 2 to the right. But that is the exact same thing as adding 2, right? Those accomplish the same thing. So we get that subtracting negative 2 is the same thing as adding 2. So similarly to what we had up here, we can say subtracting a negative is the same as addition. So let's try some examples to illustrate that more clearly. So if I did 5 minus negative 2, I'll take my number lines over here again. So subtracting a negative, that's the same thing as adding. So we're adding 2. 1, 2, right? Because we're going in the opposite direction as what subtraction does because we're subtracting a negative. Normally subtraction goes to the left, now we're going to the right. And so that means we've moved 2, same as adding by 2. And where does 5 line up with? 5 lines up with 7, which is what 5 plus 2 is, right? So we get that 5 minus negative 2 is the same as 5 plus 2 is the same as 7. All right, and another one we could try is like negative 3 minus negative 2. Well, negative 3, that lines up with negative 1. And that's because minusing a negative is the same thing as addition, so we get minus 3 plus 2, which is negative 1. So that's more or less it, and it might seem kind of odd that addition and subtraction are actually kind of two sides of the same coin. But the thing is when we think about them in terms of the fact that they shift number lines, both of them shift a number line just in a different direction, right? And as soon as we introduce a negative, which switches our direction, we get a very convenient means of converting between addition and subtraction. So one thing you can do for some examples is convert the sum into a difference. So, for example, 5 plus 3, how could I express that using subtraction? Well, it'd be 5 minus. Now this goes to the right, and subtraction goes to the left, but how do we make this go in the opposite direction? We subtract a negative, right? Because a negative is what's reversing our direction. So we get that 5 plus 3 can be expressed as this difference with subtraction. Another example might be 7 plus 4. That could be expressed as 7 minus negative 4, because this is shifting to the right by 4. The subtraction here is a shift to the left, but then this minus here means that we're shifting in the opposite direction as we would have been going, which means that instead of going left, we're going right. So that means this is the same as that. All right, and we can also do a similar problem where it's convert the difference into a sum. All right, so we have 7 minus 2, but that's the same thing as 7 plus minus 2, right? We're starting at 7, and we're going 2 to the left. And here, if we're adding, that means we're going to the right. But again, this negative here will reverse the direction of what we would expect this to do, which means it's actually going to be going to the left by 2. So these accomplish the same thing. And let's go 12 minus 10. That can be written as 12 plus negative 10. since this means we are moving to the left by 10, and this negative 10 here means that we're going to be going in the opposite direction of what the plus would say, so we're actually also still moving to the left by 10, so these are equal. Alright, well, I hope you found that video useful. If you're a bit confused, don't worry, we'll have a lot of practice exercises in the next video. So until then, have a good one, stay groovy, and I'll see you in the next video.